Hello. All right. Well, I think we're going to get started. It's weird. I can't really see people right now, but hi, I'm Margaret Tucker. I'm on the GitHub policy team. And we are here today for a Maintainer Month live stream that will be getting into the wide range of age assurance proposals that we're seeing in the US states, as well as in Brazil, Europe, just kind of all over the place, and what it means for open source and developers. And so this is really, I guess, like a developer first policy discussion. We're going to be focusing on what people need to know as maintainers, looking really into like what these proposals technically mean, and also opportunities for improvement and places where we've seen success for open source advocacy. So I am going to, I guess, open it up to Anne and Katie, who are our two panelists. So Anne and Katie, hello. Happy Friday. Hey.
Happy Friday.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. So I guess Anne and Katie, could you guys introduce yourselves and your organizations?
Sure. So my name's Katie Steen-James. I'm the Senior U.S. Policy Manager for the Open Source Initiative. For those of you that don't know the OSI, we are a nonprofit organization that was created in the late 1990s as the stewards of the open source definition. So you may be familiar with OSI-approved licenses. And since the late 90s, we have been approving licenses that are submitted to our license committee. We review them against the open source definition, and then if they meet the definition, they become OSI approved licenses. And they're really the backbone of the open source community because they communicate what people can do with the code and the four freedoms. We also have worked on applying the four freedoms of the open source definition to AI, releasing an open source AI definition in October of 2024. So I'm excited to be here and talk with you all today.
Awesome. Welcome, Katie. And Anne, hello.
Hi, I'm Ann Dickison. I'm the Deputy Director at the FreeBSD Foundation. For those of you who don't know, the FreeBSD Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission it is to support the FreeBSD project. So we do that through infrastructure support, software development work, advocacy and education, and we're also the legal entity for the project. But the FreeBSD project is a separate organization. They have their own leadership, the core team, and they make all the decisions that happen pertaining to the operating system itself. So we're sort of new to this arena. I'm not a policy person, but this has been a really interesting and educational experience, and I'm really happy to be here to talk about it today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always say the best developer policy people are developers. So I think that it's great to have you guys here. So I guess before we get into the questions that I have for both of you, I kind of just want to go through, I guess, explaining what the substance of what we're talking about. So we're talking about age assurance, and that is kind of an umbrella term. It can mean a lot of different things. So at like kind of the most restrictive level is age verification. And so that typically means what's considered like highly effective age assurance methods, like through using photo ID, like financial institutions. And so when people kind of use those interchangeably, they might assume that age assurance means that it's not, and oftentimes not the case, including in quite a few of the proposals we're seeing. There's also age estimation. So age estimation is estimating ages based off of signals, biometric scanning. And there's also age attestation, which is what I think we're kind of used to, kind of the earlier stages of social media where, it asks you what age you are. I'll just say I was very young and saying I was much older on social media. And so attestation is, I would say, like the lower, least confidence level of that. You're just kind of inputting your age. So it's really important to kind of look into the actual, legislative text for any of these proposals and kind of get into what they're proposing. And there's a lot of different trade-offs between these different approaches for, privacy. If you're giving away information that impacts, your own privacy, cybersecurity, and, ultimately, freedom of information, ability to participate in the internet, and there's a lot of trade-offs here. I think this is a really important discussion for all people who are using the internet, as well as people who really care about children and their safety online. My cats are in the background. It's Friday. What can I say? And then I guess also what's important as well, as along with the kind of what these proposals mean, is where they're hitting in the tech stack. So when we were kind of first seeing this wave of age assurance and age verification proposals, they first were really focused on social media and the social media minimum age. So we've seen that in Australia, they passed the social media minimum age. GitHub is out of scope for that, I'll just say, but it's there have been some where they that has come forward. The UK Online Safety Act has required highly effective age assurance for adult content websites. So there's a couple of places where this has happened, where it's specifically on the platform, the website, like kind of like that vector of content. But what we're seeing more and more, and where this has really come up for open source, is we've seen quite a few proposals that are moving down the tech stack into operating systems, applications. I think we've seen some for browsers. So there's just kind of like app stores as well. So there's just a change in who would be responsible for this, how that kind of age assurance would be applied, how it works in practice. And this raises a lot of questions for developers. Obviously, Anne talked about FreeBSD, open source operating system. I think a lot of people's entry point into open source is through open source operating systems. So it's a really important discussion for the open source community. And it's also really important because I think developers are more technically informed about what these certain definitions mean. And when it comes to defining what an application is or what an app store is, actually knowing what you're saying and applying that, aligning regulatory intent with like technical reality is really important. So that's my spiel. We have a GitHub blog on this that's linked. So if you're interested in a more, I guess, in-depth, information on this and different proposals, you can have that. But we're going to make use of our fantastic speakers that we have today. And so get into the questions that I want to hear from you both on. So my first question for both of you is, so I'm curious, what made age assurance laws something that your organization felt like it needed to pay attention to? And when did this become an open source issue in your mind?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can start by saying first, I want to thank you, Margaret, for letting us know that, these bills were out there. It wasn't really on age attestation, something we were tracking that closely. In general, not just on age attestation, but we've seen so much more in the United States policy coming up at the state level that may impact open source. And so, trying to track all of that across has certainly been a challenge. So we kind of have to rely on partners and things like that. But then, beyond Margaret, you kind of flagging it for us, I started to get questions like from Anne at the FreeBSD Foundation asking, what we are hearing about this. FreeBSD Foundation is a member of the Open Policy Alliance, which is a coalition that OSI leads of nonprofit open source organizations that may not have internal policy people, but still want to engage in policy discussions around open source. So I started also hearing more from those members, asking questions about what's the community doing on this. And frankly, there's been a variety of kind of responses that we've seen in the community, depending on how big the project is, considering should we do this? How do we do this? Do we have to do this? All of those questions started to come up. And that's why we at OSI realized we need to, start tracking this, because it is going to affect a lot of open source projects.
Oh, absolutely. How about you, Anne?
Yeah, and for us, it sort of came to our attention through the community. We were getting questions from community members in Brazil and California and Colorado saying, how is this going to affect us? How is this going to affect FreeBSD? What are you going to do? I was like, oh, that's a good question. So I started talking to other members of the community to sort of get their take. They'd been discussing it internally as well. And, when you're looking at the text of legislation, it's very unclear. And so that's when I reached out to Katie and was like, what do you know about this? Help. So it was really great to be brought into the discussion and learn more about what we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I will say it's been really fascinating to see how much of the kind of developer policy discussions have been happening on Reddit and Hacker News. It's really like I've become like my resource to hear what people are talking about. But we definitely, I think we could use better channels to hear about what developers are concerned about. So I guess this is a question. You sort of got started talking about this, Anne, but FreeBSD is an operating system that could be in scope for these regulations. What questions or concerns specifically have you been hearing from your developer community?
A lot of it is just uncertainty, right? Like, where do we fit? Will our ports and packages system be an app store? How does that work? How are we going to implement it to any change that fit all the different laws, right? Because every state has something different. Then you talk about Brazil, which is even something more extreme than the other one. So it's all about like uncertainty about what FreeBSD needs to do. So I think that's the biggest thing, and also the privacy and security concerns that go around that. Operating systems don't typically hold on to user information and things like that. So there's a lot of the unknown. That's really what's crossing the minds of our community.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know it's like the unknown when you are a volunteer or leading a small project. Like it's do you really want to take on that kind of liability question? I think it can be really challenging. So we kind of hinted at this. Katie, this is a question for you. So a lot of these bills use broad definitions of application, app store. So when those definitions are too broad, what kinds of open source infrastructure risks getting swept into, the scope of the law?
Yeah, it's a great question. And frankly, I think we're still even trying to figure that out, just how much it impacts it. But, one example that I know you've also been thinking about, Margaret, is F-Droid. So, they are an application, a free and open source app that you can download that then gives you access to their repository of other, free and open source applications. People can download their app and then kind of upload or use their own repository that is not just F-Droids. But yeah, there has been a lot of questions for them. What is this law, or what is this potential implementation of the law look like for them? And we have been, trying to understand their processes and other, not even just other app stores, but other open source projects and other operating systems that use or implement the F-Droid app or come with it installed sometimes. What is this all going to mean for them? And I think the most challenging thing is, open source projects, that kind of the nature of them are to operate kind of very differently. There's not a one size fits all approach that really works for all the open source projects. So so much of our time, as you know, Margaret and Anne, has been trying to read legislative text, trying to then understand how each open source project, and there are many of them, would be in scope or not in scope. And that in and of itself is super challenging. So I think there's even impacts that we don't fully know yet. But F-Droid is kind of one of the major ones that sticks out as being included in a broad definition of application or app store.
Yeah, no, totally. And it's one of those things where I think, when you think about the regulatory intent for something like this, they are talking about Google Play and Apple. But then when you read the definitions, it's like, well, this includes everything where you can download an application, and then application is defined as software. So I think it's one of those things where we don't want to be like, I don't know. It's a hard balance of not wanting to have excessive concern, getting people to panic. But also, that said, if something goes into law, it's law. And so that could be, used to go after smaller projects that might not be able to kind of work with the legal implications of that. So it is, it's important. And I think, all of these things are complex. And so it's really important to bring in technical communities when you're making tech policy. All right. So I guess this is a question for you, Anne. So, many of these laws assume, like we were talking about, Google or Apple app stores, assume that there's a centralized provider with user accounts and control over how software is used. How does that assumption break down for open source operating systems and other volunteer-led projects?
Yeah, it's kind of like apples and oranges, really, because of the way that open source operating systems work, right? I mean, it's not a closed consumer platform. There is not one company controlling, the user account, the how the software is installed, the app store itself. So, like with FreeBSD, it can be downloaded, it can be mirrored, it can be modified. You can redistribute it, you can embed it into a product. And for the most part, the project's not going to know who's doing that and what they're doing. And so if a law is assuming that the provider can identify the user and know their birthday and control how things are installed, that's just not how open source operating systems work.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of centralized control, and even like how they monetize things. Like it's just it's a different thing entirely. All right, this is a question for you, Katie. What do lawmakers most often misunderstand about how open source software is built, distributed, and actually reaches users themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a couple things that I, have run into when talking with policymakers. So one of them is just this kind of not understanding that the deployer and the developer are not always the same entity. So they may be in, more traditional kind of software development where the same entity or company has both the developer and the deployer. But as we know, in open source, that's often not the case. But it's not easily kind of understood to somebody that's not, looking at this technology every day. So I spend a lot of time educating policymakers about that delineation between deployer and developer. And I know that's been really important in the European Union context as well with Cyber Resilience Act and other things. So that's one. And then additionally, it's just understanding how open source licenses work. So this is broader than age attestation or age assurance policy issues, but just in general, especially come to play more with conversations around AI and wanting to regulate that. A lot of folks don't realize that an open source license means that you don't have control of downstream users, coming back to that control piece that you mentioned. So when we are telling folks an open source license, if you put that on your code, you cannot revoke the license if a downstream user of your code, does something that they shouldn't or does something that is not in alignment, with the law, the basically contract that you are giving that person when you put an open source license on your code is that you won't revoke the license and you can't. In addition to not being able to revoke the license, there's just not a workflow of control or keeping tabs on what's happening to your code downstream. So in addition to the kind of legal issue with the license, there's also just kind of a practical and technical issue with trying to be tracking all the downstream uses of your code. And so that's what I spend a lot of time, educating people about. And, I'm not a technical person by training. I'm a policy person. So, it's not something I fully realized either before, I started working at OSI. So that's a really important piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, I think that ultimately what I would really love to see is policymakers and their staffers learning how to, not just GitHub, but having a GitHub account, making your own stuff. And I will just say, like, AI is making it more possible for people to become developers. And I do think that ultimately the hands-on experience of both developers becoming policymakers and policymakers becoming developers will really help them be able to realize what all this looks like. We had a discussion with some staffers recently about one of these bills, and we did use the example of Instagram, and how many open source components go into something ultimately becoming an Instagram. You can look at for any piece of software, like the long list of open source licenses in those contracts. It's definitely something that I think people like the component side of what ends up being a end user consumer software application is, I guess, less understood, but hopefully it will become more so. Yeah, we really have this trove of knowledge that is enabled because people freely share it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I don't need to tell you guys how cool open source is. All right, well, I guess let's move to another question. This is one for both of you. We've kind of talked about it a little bit, but yeah, what chilling effects or liability concerns worry you the most if these laws remain overbroad, where we don't think they're trying to go after open source operating systems, for example, but the language itself is kind of ambiguous?
So I can take that one to start. I mean, I think it's really sort of a few things. Overcorrection might be an issue. I mean, if you see this and you're uncertain about, does this affect me? Does that mean you're going to do things like restrict access or, not allow folks from certain areas to use your software? Nobody wants that, right? But if you're a small organization, a small project, you're not going to have the resources. So it's better to just take that off the table, right? So I think that's a really big part of it. And also, people might hesitate to even use open source going forward if it's not clear about how they'll be affected. So I think those are sort of broad chilling effects. You just don't want folks to be cautious and not engaged because of fear of what it might do, what the consequences might be for laws like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add that speaking of the consequences, in addition to the definitions and kind of who's in scope and those concerns, there's also concerns about what is the actual legal consequence. So kind of depending on, the state or the law, some might be, well, the attorney general can bring a civil action against you, or sorry, somebody else can bring a civil action against you. In some cases, I mean, what I would be most concerned about is if it can result in a criminal action. So you are charged with a crime for not, complying, when in reality, the law was created without fully understanding how open source works. And I think, if we're talking about a criminal penalty, that has even more of a chilling effect than, a civil penalty where somebody can, can sue you and, perhaps get damages paid to them or something like that. So that would be my biggest concern, is just, what the risk that people are taking on. And even if an open source developer maybe would win some kind of lawsuit in the end, the amount of money and know-how that it would require them to defend themselves against that, would be really, really chilling on the whole community.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, is this worth it to really, fight, even if you think you're right? I think that's always a challenge. And obviously, there are, fantastic strategic litigation efforts in the open source community.
Certainly don't want to scare everyone, but we're just, talking about the actual potential chilling effect. Yeah. Yes.
No, absolutely. And I will say too, just because I've really been on Hacker News and Reddit and reading a lot about all these things, I do think that people need to take a bit of a pause and really understand what these laws are proposing, how how it's going to move through. So depending on if it's a state, oftentimes states will pass a bill and then plan to amend it for several years until it actually goes into force. And so that's a really important thing to be aware of, is that sometimes things aren't a done deal. And don't assume that because this language is overbroad or ambiguous means that it can't be improved or that they are trying to go after you. So I think it's important to kind of remember that empowerment. And for example, for Brazil, the digital ECA, that is one that includes operating systems, but they do have these caveats of likely to be accessed by children. And the definitions that they're using there are, if you read it, you would think, okay, I don't think, open source operating systems are likely to be accessed by children through the definition that they're using. So yeah, I don't know. I always want people to be aware of, how much agency we do have to get these things improved, and don't allow those potential chilling effects to unnecessarily chill you.
Yes.
Yeah, and I guess to get into the more positive side of this, I would love to talk about some recent successes that we've seen in this space. So we've seen some really positive developments in California and Colorado in response to concerns from the open source community. And I guess I'm curious from your guys' perspective, listening to these hearings, seeing the amendments develop, what have these experiences taught you about how developers and open source organizations can engage effectively?
Yeah, I think for OSI, our engagements on this so far have been in an educational capacity because we're not doing any direct lobbying, but we can meet with policymakers and explain to them, how open source development works and, broad concerns over certain kind of policy approaches without directly commenting on bill text or something like that. And I think that, as technology becomes more and more complex, we're all trying to understand how it works. And I think you've really got to meet policymakers where they are, both in their understanding of the technology, but also the real concerns that they're trying to address. And not, we've talked a lot about, our concerns, of course, with these policies, but, it's also important for us to recognize and try to understand the goal of the policymaker. And that can help us think through different ideas to really address what they're trying to address in a way that is not, trading off the access to this like public resource of, software code that has been so important. So I think that has been a benefit to the open source communities that have engaged with policymakers is really approach it not from a, this is a really bad idea, and instead approaching it from a look, we just want to, provide more insight from our community and what we're actually seeing to help you understand. And then we'd also like to understand, what your goals are so that, we can work together, because I don't think, open source communities are writ large anti-regulation on technology or anything like that. It's just about understanding. And then, for the people that can lobby, trying to get surgical on what the language changes that would, put open source out of scope, or really try to address the concern that the policymaker has, actually reach that point by being surgical on the text and making sure it's clear, and that erases some of that uncertainty that, Anne was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Anne, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. Like for us, though, it was almost a bigger lesson is that we don't have to figure it out on our own, right? I mean, I think that's when you see these lessons, and I wasn't aware so much about the process. Like Margaret, you just talked about how, there's the amendments and so, and even that we could be involved to educate those folks. So I think engagement has just been really important, early engagement, if you can.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the biggest thing for us, I think.
No, totally. And I have to say, I think that an underrated piece is, you mentioned education, Katie, and I think that's really important. I want to see more, I guess, like understanding about the benefits of participating in the open source community to young people. Because, like when people are thinking about harm to children, obviously there's, exposure to, adult content, harmful content. But I think a lot of these things are focused on features that promote, unhealthy use of a platform, features that encourage like excessive consumption, targeted advertising, a lot of things that just don't exist on, open source operating systems that aren't really focused on monetization. And I think as well, something I believe strongly with, the open source world is that it gives more agency to people using computers. And that in turn, I think, makes people more digitally literate, more capable of navigating the online world and seeing themselves as, someone with agency instead of solely a consumer. And so I think it can kind of be a really positive thing. And I would love to kind of see the focus on, I guess, what are these features that promote harm and how can we focus on that? Because I think you're really understanding like monetization and incentives on platforms is really, really important to understand how any of these work. And yeah, so my spiel, but open source, it's good. And we want policymakers to see that and, kind of, I guess, not just avoid regulating us, but consider how they could make the whole world more like us. Yeah. So, I'm really happy to see these successes. I think that, something that we've been talking about a lot with what's happening in the U.S. states is thinking about how we could improve our own, open source policy ecosystem. So this is a question mainly for you, Katie. So you kind of mentioned the Cyber Resilience Act. So looking to Europe, the open source community has already had successful engagement on open source software concerns on major files like the Copyright Directive and the Cyber Resilience Act. So what lessons should the open source community in US states and elsewhere take from that experience, particularly on coordination and shaping technical definitions?
Yeah, I think for better or for worse, the community in Europe had to kind of come together and be more coordinated because of the Copyright Directive, because of the Cyber Resilience Act. And that kind of organically, as I understand it, created a community where people from nonprofits and academics and industry were all coming together to try to explain and educate the European Commission about how open source works. So when I talked earlier about the deployer versus developer, that distinction was a really important part of the Cyber Resilience Act implementation. So ensuring that those regulations weren't going to be, put on open source developers, but were put on the deployers who, one, understand more, the cyber implications, and also, not to create that chilling effect on the open source developers. So Europe has had that kind of initially maybe kind of unfortunate and concerning opening bid on what things like the Cyber Resilience Act and the Copyright Directive should look like, but ultimately ended in a very good place where there's a continuous and helpful relationship between the European Commission and the open source community. I think in the US, it's a little bit more challenging because we are so decentralized, and we have the federal government, but then we also have 50 states that can all take their own approach. And then even within the federal government, there's different agencies. So it's a little bit more like whack-a-mole, as I would describe it, in the US. But I think we can learn from, we don't all have to agree in the open source community on everything, but we're working towards building consensus where we can get it across open source communities in the US, and then being able to channel our technical expertise and that consensus that we have on certain issues to policymakers. I've heard directly from a policymaker that it's hard to know, like, who is a thought leader, or can be a thought partner for them from the open source community. They just almost don't know who to call, immediately, where, they do know who to call from, other parts of the tech industry, obviously, that have, larger policy and lobbying operations, but they don't know in the open source community. So the more we can, take a lesson from Europe and, put it in the US context, I think we can be more effective. And I think policymakers would really appreciate that, because their jobs are hard as well. The staff, they're trying to make sense of many different issues, and, try to take what they're hearing from some stakeholders and then put that into legislation. It's very difficult. So I think it would be welcomed from policymakers if we could be a bit more coordinated in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. So I think that, in some ways, because Europe has had these, high profile proposals that have concerned open source and software, the open source community has then become more organized. I've always been there's this one article I reference constantly. It's called How the Law Created Silicon Valley. And it's really interesting because it talks about, the US tech sector and the role that a more permissive, liability environment kind of allowed that to flourish, among other things. Research funding was a big part of that as well. But yeah, no, I definitely think like the legal environment's really important, and we are seeing a really significant shift within the U.S. Because frankly, I cover federal and state, and it's pretty wild that we're not seeing things coming out of Congress, and we don't expect it until I think at least 27 when it comes to tech regulation, and what that means when we're facing a generationally defining technology through AI, and then this huge sway of concern when it comes to children's access, but frankly also I think this is an identity question too, which is a lot more existential. And the states don't want to wait. And so that is it's happening whether Congress is going to do anything or not. And ultimately, it does seem like we're kind of moving into a privacy situation where there are so many different state regimes that then it becomes more difficult to pass a federal version of an overarching privacy standard. They have been trying to do this in Congress since the 90s, so it still hasn't happened. So it's it's a very interesting such situation that we're in. And yeah, I definitely think more coordination would be really useful for everyone. Okay, well, this is, I guess, a good question to kind of move towards our closing. We have two more questions, and then I will say in the chat, I've seen that some people are posting questions at 9:45 my time, but 45 wherever you are. We will open this up to questions. So if you have any, please post them in the chat. And yeah, so I guess for both of you, if policymakers wanted to get this right, what principles should guide better tech policy design from the start?
Well, I would say, clear scope would be a step in the right direction so that we really understand that, whether or not your platform is affected by this. I think also just understanding how the technology you're trying to regulate works, right? We've talked about this a lot, and I think that's really important. If you can, and back to what Katie said about, knowing who to call, I think that's going to be a huge win if that's possible, so that these laws can be written in a more accurate manner.
Yeah, I would also just add, trying to focus on the deployer level, at least if that's where you, and also a really good point, Margaret, that you made, the features. So even beyond deployer, but the features that we're concerned about that are either driving, addictive behavior or, whatever it is, thinking about it in that way. And, I understand why initially someone would say, well, because there are less operating systems, many people assume, than there are apps, like let's try to regulate at the operating system level versus the apps, which there are tons of. But we know that can have, as we've just discussed, can be a problem for open source operating systems. So I think focusing on the features and the deployer level, talking with the open source community from the start, to Anne's point, calling those folks so you understand more as you're crafting the legislation, not afterward. And then again, just to plus one Anne's point on clarity and scope, making the language very clear, as clear as possible, so that there's not a lot of questions and we don't get that chilling effect because people don't know how their specific project is going to be impacted by this.
Yeah, no, those are both really good points. And on the who you call aspect, these two people are who you should call. Call OSI; they can provide great education. Involve the open source operating systems and their stewardship foundations that can really give you that technical perspective. I will say, also kind of looking at the U.S. Congress, they have a tech policy fellowship that brings in people who are technologists to help develop policy. And I would love to see something like that at the state level. I think it's definitely needed. I think also, at the states, there are tons of resources when it comes to people doing OSPOs at the university level, people in various technology departments who are experienced in this. So I think even helping policymakers connect within the resources that they do have is really important. So, we have a lot of work to do, but it's all, it'll all be very positive. All right, so this is our last question, and then we will open it to audience questions. So what is one thing that maintainers or developers listening today should do to stay informed or get involved in all of this?
Well, I would say first, follow your blog, Margaret, and the stuff that the GitHub policy team posts, because that's really helpful. Also, OSI posts various blogs with updates about what's going on in the policy world. And if you are a member of an open source project or community that has a nonprofit attached to it, I would really encourage you to join the Open Policy Alliance, which is the coalition I mentioned earlier of nonprofit open source orgs that OSI leads. And it's our goal really is to just help nonprofit orgs and open source engage in policy. So if your project or organization isn't a part of that yet, I encourage you to join it. It's free to join. And then we have meetings, every other month where we give updates on what's happening. And you can see where there are opportunities if you want to get more involved and engage with your policymaker. So that was 3 things. I'm sorry. That's supposed to be 1.
Well, and I would
one thing interpreted loosely.
That works. Well, and mine kind of echo that. I mean, definitely, if you can join OPA, you should do that. It's been really important, I think, for the foundation because we don't have the resources to spend time tracking all this, right? That's just not the kind of organization that we are. And I think just letting maintainers know that you can make a difference and you can have a voice and, find the place that, find an organization, talk to OSI, talk through OPA, or just even talk to OSI in general if you can't join OPA, and offer to be the expert, if you have questions, if you know something is not written correctly or know something isn't even feasible and you can provide that expertise. I mean, I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, that is so awesome. And yeah, no, I definitely it's one of those things where we don't want people to panic. We want them to really, delve into this and see themselves as, empowered. But I also think there's been so many great examples of, especially in Colorado, like the Colorado hearing that happened a couple weeks ago. That was amazing because developers were just really, talking about their perspective, providing their technical expertise. And I would say that Colorado has had the most profound improvement in their operating system, age assurance law that they put out there. I guess it's also app stores. But yeah, and that was really, all through efforts from the community, really, I would say fantastic example of successful, advocacy there. And that was really it was people, primarily developers in Colorado.
Yeah, just organic.
Yeah. Call your representative. Everyone is a lot easier to contact than people think. And so that is one thing, including us. You could definitely get in touch with people if you are concerned or want to get involved. And yeah, developers are the experts on developer policy. All right, so we are coming into our question time for the rest of this chat. Let me see what we've got. A lot of people from a lot of different countries. I'm seeing that. Okay. And hello to everyone. I'm so glad that we can get so many people. This is also, we're talking about US states for the most part, but this really is a global issue. So fantastic to see all this representation. Okay. So I'm seeing a question. Given open source risks, what are the reservations towards age assurance? And how does this pushback conflict with the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child? I love that question.
It's a good question. Do you want me to take a stab at it?
Yeah, go for it.
I'd be interested in your thoughts, Margaret and Ann, too. I think that it's really important to not assume that open source has any more risk than closed source software. And for it to be treated differently, or for it to be treated any more risky than closed source. So that's one thing. I don't have the Declaration of Rights of the Child from the UN in front of me. But to me, this gets back to trying to understand the goal of the policymaker, which, in many of these cases, maybe it's protecting children online, and trying to understand what features of technology are impacting or that we're concerned about in terms of, safety of children online, in trying to be specific in the legislation at targeting those features versus more blanket, all operating systems have to, do XYZ. And open source has just a particularly difficult time doing that than a proprietary operating systems for the reasons that we outlined. But for me, I think it's really trying to understand what the concern is. It's not that, we shouldn't be protecting children online. That's not anybody's position, at least that I know of, but it's a question of how we do that and wanting to make sure we're actually getting at the root of the concern.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess so the parts of those questions, like the open source risks, I think you get at that well. Like, what are we really talking about here? Because, again, like I mentioned, the benefits to open source, I think there's quite a few of those. And I don't consider it inherently more risky. I actually consider it in a lot of ways more privacy preserving, secure, transparent, and less focus on monetization, which is oftentimes where we see a lot of incentivization for negative things online. But I really liked that question because it brought up the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. I do think that the kind of like children's digital rights aspect of this, discussion is really neglected. And so I don't have the full declaration on top of my head, but I know that there are, elements of freedom of expression, participation, access to knowledge. And I do think it's really important to kind of keep the human rights aspect, in discussion here, because there is so much to the internet. The internet is, it's access to the world, access to information, ability to participate. There's people from, so many different contexts where, having access to the internet is completely transformative, changes their life, gives them opportunities. And so we really need to be very serious about, what it means to close people off from that, make it more difficult to engage. So I think that it's really important to keep our eye on the prize of, the digital rights and what it's important for people to have access to in the world. This is just a quick one. I think it could be useful just because, it's a question about open source licensing for you, Katie. So this one, it says, are you implying by choosing the license, open source repos take responsibility for downstream users' use? And this is, sorry, I'm just very naive. So I think maybe good just intervention to explain what we mean by that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I do not mean that. They should not be taking on the responsibility for downstream users. And the license itself does not do that. The concern is that laws, and this is not the age assurance law in California, but there is another law that would, as it currently states, require a developer, open source or not, to revoke a license if somebody downstream took their code and removed some of the AI detection tools that this law wants to make sure that generative AI systems have. And in the open source case, if that were to be a law, it would mean that an open source developer would then potentially be violating their own license if they did not revoke the license, take back the open source license from the person downstream who took out the AI detection tool that was supposed to be included. So you are not taking on responsibility for downstream users' use if you use an open source license, but this law would put people that do use an open source license in a weird position because they would need to be adhering to the license, but they would also then have this state law and it would be conflicting. So that was our concern there. But no, by choosing an open source license, you are not responsible for downstream users' use.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good core tenet and definitely something to understand. And we're seeing this, I think like the AI side is a huge part of this discussion is, open source licenses are meant to enable free sharing and they're not meant to be kind of leveraged as a way to exert downstream control and get, open source developers to be, enforcers of laws. So really important to understand that. I'm looking through the questions. I'm not sure if I'm seeing any other ones that are the best fit for this. Some people were saying it's breaking. Sorry about that. There will be a recording. So if Hopefully the recording is not broken. So I think that might be what we've got. So yeah, I guess thanks to you both for joining this live stream. I've really enjoyed talking to both of you, and also really enjoyed working more with both of you, and the kind of the broader open source coalition that we're trying to build in the U.S. to hopefully improve the developer policy environment in the U.S. Is there anything else you guys want to add or plug before we close up?
I will just ask Andrea maybe to share the other link, which is to our 2-pager. That this is an example of not a lobbying piece, but an educational document that we share with lawmakers that talks about the benefits of open source and the importance of differentiating between deployer and developer, and then not making sure that they understand downstream uses. You can't revoke a license for downstream uses. So that's just an example that you can check out. It's on our website of how we educate policymakers about these issues.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, the resources that you guys provide are super important. So yeah, appreciate you sharing that. All right, well, thank you both so much for this. Really appreciate it. Thanks everyone who joined for this call. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your Friday. And yeah, we really appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you, Katie, for all your work, and Margaret as well. You guys are just from the open source operating system. It's really important the work you're doing, and we really appreciate it.
Open source is the best. What can we say? Really important to stick up for. All right.
Thank
Bye,
you all.
guys. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.